He left her in the delivery room, terrified of being a father. 3 years later, he saw their twin daughters and couldn't stop crying. Karen Brooks had never felt so small in her life. The hospital walls, once sterile and cold, now felt suffocating as she clutched the side of the bed, her breathing erratic, her vision blurred from the tears she refused to let fall. The monitors beeped steadily, indifferent to her fear, her pain, or the fact that the man who was supposed to stand beside her was standing across the room, pacing like a trapped animal. Alexander Hale, the golden CEO who commanded boardrooms with a single glance, was now fidgeting, restless, his eyes darting anywhere but toward her. She had reached out for his hand moments ago, gripping his fingers as another contraction hit, sharp and relentless. His hand had been cold, rigid, as if her touch burned. She tried to meet his gaze, to ground him, to pull him into this moment where their lives were about to change forever. But his eyes refused to stay on her. They flicked toward the door, toward the window, anywhere that wasn't her. "Alex," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I need you here." The silence that followed wasn't loud. It was suffocating. He didn't come closer. Instead, his shoulders straightened, as if some internal decision had been made, one that carved a canyon between them. He walked toward the side of the room, picking up his jacket with a mechanical grace that felt surreal. Karen's heart pounded harder than the contractions. She knew what was coming before he spoke. "I can't do this, Karen," he said, his tone flat, almost rehearsed, but his fingers trembled as they adjusted his watch. "I'm not ready to be a father. I can't, this isn't my life." It wasn't a heated argument. There was no shouting. Just the quiet, shattering realization that everything they had built was crumbling in the moment she needed him most. She sat there, her body racked with pain, clutching the life they had created inside her, while he stood by the door, his back already half turned. "I'm about to give birth to your children, Alex," she said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "You're going to walk away now?" His jaw clenched, his gaze finally landing on her, but there was a glass wall between them. "I'm not the man for this, Karen. I'm not him. You deserve someone who knows how to stay." She wanted to scream at him. To beg. But as another wave of pain twisted through her, something in her snapped into clarity. He wasn't staying. No amount of pleading would change that. The man who had whispered promises into her hair at night was already gone. All that remained was a stranger in an expensive suit, afraid of the life about to be born. "Then go," she said, her voice breaking but resolute. "If you're going to run, do it now. Because once these girls are here, you won't get another chance to walk away." He opened his mouth as if to speak, to offer some diluted version of an apology, but she turned her face away. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. The door opened with a soft click, but it might as well have been a cannon blast. He was gone. Just like that. The nurses returned, their faces kind and oblivious, their hands adjusting monitors, preparing her for delivery. Karen answered their questions with numb efficiency, her heart pounding not from fear, but from the roaring emptiness that filled the space Alex had vacated. As the contractions intensified, as the room became a blur of instructions and medical jargon, Karen realized that from this moment on, she was the only person in the world these girls could count on. No more fantasies. No more illusions. Just her. She gritted her teeth, steeling herself not just against the pain, but against the weight of the years ahead. And when the first cry pierced through the haze, raw and fragile, Karen's tears finally fell. But they weren't for Alex. They were for the two tiny girls who had no idea they had been born into a world where their father had already chosen fear over them. But Karen made a promise in that moment. He may have left, but she would never. The apartment was small, but it was theirs. Karen had never imagined she would raise children in a place where the walls were so thin she could hear the neighbor's television through the plaster, or where the windows rattled when the wind howled at night. Yet, as she sat on the worn couch, cradling Hannah in one arm while Holly slept on her chest, she realized that space didn't matter. Safety did. And in this tiny apartment, surrounded by hand-me-down furniture and thrift store blankets, she had created a world where her daughters were safe, even if she wasn't. The first months were a blur of exhaustion. Sleep was something Karen read about in books now, not something she experienced. She had become a master at balancing bottles in one hand while soothing cries with the other, her movements fluid from repetition, her mind sharp from necessity. Every day was a battle of priorities, diapers or rent, formula or electricity. Choices that never should have existed, but were now her reality. She became resourceful, crafting hair bows and baby accessories to sell online, spending long nights sewing until her fingers ached while her daughters slept in the next room, their soft breaths the only soundtrack to her determination. There were nights she would sit in the dark, after the twins had finally quieted, staring at the ceiling with a crushing weight on her chest. Not from regret, she didn't regret Hannah and Holly for a second, but from the sheer magnitude of doing it all alone. The betrayal was still there, tucked into the corners of her thoughts, but it no longer defined her. The anger toward Alex had cooled into something colder, more distant. He was a shadow that had been cut from their lives, and she had no intention of letting him back in, even if a part of her still dreamed of what could have been. The city wasn't kind to single mothers, especially those who refused to fit into a narrative of victimhood. Karen refused pity. She took every freelance job she could find. Cleaning offices after hours, waitressing at a cafe on weekends, and still, every morning, she woke up with a smile for her girls, because they deserved a mother who showed them love didn't come with conditions. It was on one of those weekends, after a particularly grueling shift, that she experienced a moment she would never forget. It was a Sunday, crisp and bright, and the park near their apartment was alive with families, strollers, and laughter. Karen had bundled the girls up in their little jackets, their matching hats slipping over their blonde curls as they squealed at the sight of falling leaves. She couldn't afford fancy playdates or expensive toys, but the park was free, and for Hannah and Holly, it was a wonderland. She watched them from a bench, a cup of cheap coffee in her hand, her heart full despite the exhaustion that never quite left her bones. Strangers passed by, some offering small smiles at the sight of the twins playing, others oblivious, lost in their own lives. Karen had become used to blending into the background, her struggles invisible to a world that rarely noticed women like her. But that day, as she watched her daughters chase each other near the sandbox, she felt a strange sense of victory. She had been left in the delivery room, abandoned by the man who had promised forever, yet here she was, raising two incredible little girls who knew nothing of abandonment. They only knew love, warmth, and the quiet strength their mother carried like armor. Karen didn't know that just a few blocks away, Alex Hale was sitting in a glass-walled office, staring out at the city with a hollow chest, haunted by the memories of the life he had thrown away. But in this moment, their worlds were still separate, orbiting the same city but on different planes. She didn't think about him anymore. Not because the pain was gone, but because she no longer allowed it to dictate her future. She had learned how to survive without him. More importantly, she had learned how to live. That evening, as she tucked Hannah and Holly into their shared crib, watching them curl into each other like they had in the womb, Karen felt a calmness settle over her. They were safe. They were loved. And that, she decided, was enough. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: Alex Hale might have walked away from them once, but she would never allow him, or anyone else, to define the life she was building with her daughters. They had lost him. But they hadn't lost themselves. The city hadn't changed, but Alex Hale had. 3 years could pass without anyone noticing when you lived in boardrooms and penthouses, drowning in contracts and polished lies, but when you carried regret like a stone in your chest, time moved differently. It wasn't a calendar full of meetings that marked his days anymore, it was the nights he spent wondering what his daughters' voices sounded like, what color their eyes had become, whether they would ever know his name. He had convinced himself that staying away had been noble. That Karen and the girls deserved better than the flawed man who had walked out of that hospital room. But that lie had unraveled slowly, painfully, until the life he had built seemed hollow. He had tried distractions, acquisitions, partnerships, headlines that painted him as a visionary leader, but none of it silenced the quiet ache that grew louder with every year. That ache became unbearable on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. He wasn't supposed to be in that park. His meetings had finished early, and the city air felt suffocating inside his office. He had taken a walk, more out of aimlessness than intent, his mind cluttered with the usual noise, when a familiar sound cut through the chaos. Laughter. Not the hollow kind he was used to hearing at corporate galas, but genuine, untamed, and so achingly pure that it stopped him in his tracks. He turned toward the sound, and his breath hitched. Across the park, near a weathered wooden bench, Karen sat with a book in her lap. She hadn't seen him. Her hair was longer now, her posture still carried the grace he remembered, but she looked different. Stronger. More self-contained. But it wasn't her that made his legs weaken. It was the two little girls with golden blonde hair tumbling through the grass, their blue eyes, his eyes, shining with joy as they chased after bubbles that floated lazily in the breeze. He felt something fracture deep inside him. Those girls, his daughters, were alive with a world he had never been part of. He watched as Karen glanced up from her book, her gaze following the girls with a soft smile that held none of the bitterness he feared. She had done it. She had raised them without him. And they were perfect. The guilt was a physical weight now, pressing into his chest until his knees buckled. He stumbled to a nearby bench, head in his hands, his entire body shivering with the realization of what he had missed. He had imagined this moment countless times, but none of his fantasies had prepared him for the raw, suffocating grief of seeing them from a distance, untouched by his presence, thriving in a life where he was nothing more than a ghost. Tears burned his eyes, and for once, he didn't try to fight them. The polished CEO mask cracked and fell away as he wept silently, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of regret. He hadn't deserved to see them, yet here they were, existing without him, proving with every giggle that his absence hadn't been a tragedy, it had been a choice. His choice. He sat there, hidden in plain sight, watching as Karen gathered the girls for a snack. He could see the way they leaned into her, the way her hands moved with ease, balancing two toddlers as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He realized how many firsts he had missed, their first steps, first words, first birthdays. Moments he had traded for a hollow career built on fear and cowardice. But what shattered him the most was how little they needed him. They were complete without him. And yet, as if sensing his eyes on them, one of the girls, he didn't even know if it was Hannah or Holly, turned in his direction. Their gazes met, fleeting but undeniable. She didn't recognize him, of course, but in that split second, something inside him snapped. It wasn't a grand revelation or a cinematic epiphany. It was quiet, devastating, and utterly real. He had no right to be part of their lives. But he couldn't stay away. Karen noticed the shift immediately. She followed her daughter's gaze and her eyes found him. Time seemed to halt. There was no drama in her reaction. No gasp, no visible anger. She looked at him the same way she might look at a stranger sitting on a park bench. And in that moment, Alex felt the full impact of what he had done. She didn't hate him. Worse, she had moved on from him. He wanted to stand, to approach, to say something, but his feet felt anchored to the ground. What could he say that would matter? Sorry? That word had disintegrated long ago. She returned her focus to the girls, never acknowledging his presence further. That, more than any insult, was the punishment he deserved. But he didn't leave. He sat there until they packed up and left, watching from a distance as Karen herded the girls into their double stroller, their chatter fading into the city's noise. He didn't follow them. Not yet. He knew now that redemption wouldn't come with an apology. It would come with action. And it would start by showing up, not to demand a place in their lives, but to earn it. For the first time in years, Alex had clarity. He had run once. He wouldn't run again. Even if Karen never spoke to him, even if his daughters never knew who he was, he would be there. He would be present. Because some mistakes were too big for forgiveness. But that didn't mean you stopped trying. And so, sitting alone on that park bench, surrounded by the ghosts of the life he could have had, Alex Hale made a silent vow: he wouldn't leave again. Not now. Not ever. The next morning, Karen had a strange feeling, a sense of being watched, but not in a menacing way. It was a subtle presence, the weight of eyes that didn't dare come too close. She knew it was him. She had seen Alex the day before, sitting across the park, and though she hadn't let it show, her heart had reacted in a way that frustrated her. She had thought about how she would feel if that moment ever came, had rehearsed words sharper than knives, but when their eyes met, it wasn't rage that filled her, it was disappointment, cold and vast. But now, as she prepared the stroller and dressed Hannah and Holly in their matching yellow jackets, she wasn't sure what she would do if she saw him again. Part of her wanted to ignore him, to act as if he didn't exist. Another part, the quieter and more exhausted one, wondered if it was time to face him properly, not for closure, but because she was tired of dragging his absence like a shadow through every day of her life. They walked the same route to the park, the girls chattering about the birds they wanted to see, their voices pure and untouched by the complications of adulthood. Karen envied them, their world still simple and safe. When they reached their usual spot near the playground, she noticed him instantly. He was there again, leaning against a lamppost, not hiding, but not bold enough to approach. His hands were in his coat pockets, his posture tense, as though every muscle in his body was ready to react if she so much as acknowledged him. Karen didn't react immediately. She let the girls out of the stroller, helped them climb the steps of the slide, her movements deliberate, giving herself time to decide what to do. She could pretend he wasn't there, continue her day as if he were just another stranger passing through. But when she glanced back, saw the weight of guilt in his stance, the exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleepless nights and everything to do with 3 years of running, something inside her shifted. She approached him, slowly, each step measured. He noticed her immediately, his body straightening, his eyes locking onto hers with a desperation he didn't bother to mask. She stopped a few feet away, keeping the distance between them like a protective shield. "What do you want, Alex?" Her tone was calm, detached, but her heart was hammering inside her chest. He didn't speak right away. His mouth opened, then closed, as if the words had gotten stuck somewhere deep, trapped under layers of shame. He finally exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "I don't expect you to listen. I don't even know if I deserve for you to stand here. But I needed to see them. I needed to see you." Karen crossed her arms, not as a barrier, but because it grounded her. "You saw us. Now what?" His eyes flickered to the playground where Hannah and Holly played, unaware of the gravity between their parents. "I don't want to disrupt your life, Karen. I know I forfeited every right the day I left that hospital. But I can't pretend anymore. I can't live like I don't exist to them. I'm not asking you for forgiveness. I need to be here. Even if it's at a distance." His words weren't polished. They were raw, stumbled over, but genuine. Karen didn't soften. She couldn't afford to. "It's not about what you need, Alex. It's about what they need. They don't know who you are. You're not their father just because of biology. That role has to be earned, and you gave up your chance the moment you chose fear over them." Alex flinched, but he nodded. He didn't argue. Then let me earn it. I'll be here, Karen. Every day. I won't cross a line you don't allow. But I will be here. She looked at him, studied him, wondering how much of this was guilt and how much was real intent. He seemed smaller than she remembered. Not in stature, but in ego. The man who had once held himself like the world revolved around him now stood like someone who understood it didn't. She didn't have the energy to fight him. Not now. But she had the power to set the rules. You don't speak to them, she said firmly. You don't approach us. You stay where you are. You watch. If I decide one day that you're safe enough to get closer, I'll let you know. But until then, you're a stranger, Alex. Nothing more. His eyes shimmered with emotion, but he didn't protest. He simply nodded, a slight, grateful tilt of his head. It wasn't the outcome he had hoped for, but it was more than he deserved. As Karen turned to walk back to the playground, she felt his gaze follow her, but it no longer felt invasive. It felt like the beginning of a slow, difficult reckoning. That evening, as she tucked the girls into bed, Hannah whispered, "Mommy, why was that man looking at us?" Karen paused, the question slicing through her carefully maintained composure. She kissed her daughter's forehead and simply said, "Just someone figuring out what's important." She didn't owe them an explanation yet. One day, maybe, but not yet. As she lay in bed later, the city's distant hum filling the silence, Karen knew this wasn't over. Alex had returned, not with grand gestures or empty apologies, but with a presence that felt like a quiet challenge. She didn't know if she would ever forgive him. But for now, she would let him stay in the background. Watch. Wait. Let him prove that he wasn't going to run again. The days that followed became a test of quiet endurance. True to his word, Alex returned to the park every morning, never early, never late, positioning himself at a respectful distance, close enough to watch Hannah and Holly play, but far enough that it didn't feel intrusive. He didn't approach. He didn't wave. He didn't smile unless the girls happened to glance his way. He was a silent observer, a man trying to earn a place in a life that had already moved on without him. Karen noticed everything. She noticed the way his posture remained tense, as if he was constantly restraining the urge to step closer. She noticed how his eyes followed their daughter's with a softness she hadn't seen in him before, a rawness that couldn't be faked. She also noticed how he never seemed frustrated or impatient. He simply showed up, day after day, as if that simple act was all he could offer, and perhaps the only thing that mattered now. It wasn't an act. She had expected him to grow tired, to let his pride or discomfort pull him away after a few days. But he didn't. Whether it rained or the wind bit sharply, Alex Hale was there, hands in his pockets, watching with a gaze that carried both longing and quiet regret. Karen's guard didn't fall easily. She had built walls too high to let words knock them down. But action, consistent, humble action, was harder to ignore. The girls began to notice him too. Children have an uncanny ability to sense energy. They saw him not as a threat or a stranger, but as a man who was always there. They started to wave at him as they played, their innocent greetings slicing through the tension with disarming ease. One afternoon, after an exhausting morning of managing twin tantrums, Karen found herself sitting on their usual bench, head tilted back, eyes closed against the sun. She could hear Hannah and Holly giggling somewhere near the swings. She could also sense Alex's presence to her left, standing beneath a tree, still and watchful. Something in her, fatigue, frustration, or maybe a spark of cautious mercy, broke through her resolve. She spoke without opening her eyes. "You know, you're not doing yourself any favors lurking around like a ghost." There was a pause, thick with surprise. Then his voice, hesitant but steady. "I'm not sure I have the right to do more than that." Karen exhaled slowly, opening her eyes, turning her head just enough to catch his silhouette. "You don't." "Not yet. But you look ridiculous standing there pretending you're not freezing." Alex offered a faint smile, a ghost of the confident man he used to be. He approached slowly, careful with each step, like a man navigating a minefield. He didn't sit beside her. Instead, he stood a few feet away, his hands tucked deep into his coat pockets. "I'm not here to make this harder for you," he said quietly. "I just want to be a presence they can trust, even if it's from a distance." Karen studied him. His suit was absent, replaced by a simple sweater and worn jeans. His hair was longer, messier. He looked like a man who had been stripped of everything that once cushioned his ego. She could see the effort it took for him to stay humble, to fight the urge to fix things with grand gestures. For a man like Alex, restraint was perhaps the biggest apology of all. "You're on probation," she said, her tone lighter but still edged. "You're allowed to stand closer. That's all. No introductions, no claims. You're just the man who helps with the stroller if I ask." Alex's smile wasn't triumphant. It was grateful. He nodded, understanding the gravity of what she had just given him. A sliver of trust, no larger than a crack, but a crack was enough for him. From that day on, Alex became a quiet assistant in their daily routines. He would offer his hand when the stroller got caught on a curb. He would silently hand Karen a water bottle when she looked exhausted. He never overstepped. He never assumed. But every small act chipped away at the invisible wall between them. It was the girls who unknowingly accelerated the thaw. One morning, Holly, ever the braver of the two, ran up to him holding a dandelion, her face beaming with pride. "For you," she exclaimed, thrusting the flower into his hand. Alex crouched down, his hands shaking slightly as he accepted the fragile offering. "Thank you, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice catching. Karen watched, arms crossed, prepared to intervene if necessary, but when she saw how gently he handled the simple gesture, how he didn't push for more, her defenses faltered. Hannah followed suit days later, pulling him by the hand toward the sandbox as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Alex never initiated these interactions. He let them come to him, allowed their innocence to dictate the boundaries. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, painting the park in soft gold, Karen sat beside Alex on the bench, the silence between them no longer sharp, but contemplative. The girls were building something elaborate in the sandbox, their giggles filling the air. "You've been different," Karen said, not looking at him. "I don't know if it's real yet. But it feels different." Alex nodded, his gaze fixed on the twins. "I spent so long being afraid of failing that I forgot showing up mattered more than getting it right. I know I can't fix the past. But I'm here now, for as long as you'll let me be." Karen didn't respond immediately. She watched as Holly called out to Alex, demanding his attention for her newest sandcastle. He rose, moving toward her with a tenderness that was both heartbreaking and healing to witness. As she sat there, alone on the bench for the first time in days, Karen realized the weight she had been carrying wasn't just about betrayal, it was about the fear of opening up to disappointment again. But Alex wasn't asking for a second chance. He was proving he would be there even without one. And slowly, against her own expectations, Karen found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was space for him in the life she had built for herself and the girls. Not as the man who had left, but as the man who refused to leave again. It had been nearly 2 months since Alex had quietly inserted himself into the background of their lives, and Karen had to admit, though not aloud, that his persistence was beginning to feel less like an intrusion and more like an unspoken reassurance. His presence had become a constant rhythm in their routine. The girls, in their innocent simplicity, now expected him to be at the park, waiting to push them on the swings or to applaud their latest masterpiece in the sandbox. To them, he was still Mommy's friend, a gentle, patient figure who never demanded attention but was always there when needed. Karen had not made it easier for him. She hadn't offered him any path forward beyond his quiet proximity. Yet, he never wavered. There were no grand gestures, no sudden confessions begging for forgiveness. His apology came in the form of showing up, consistently, humbly, without expectations. And that, more than any words, began to erode the walls she had built to keep him out. But she also knew Alex's world was not a quiet one. His family, especially his father, thrived on control, on appearances. And a man like Alexander Hale didn't disappear from headlines just because he wanted to. She had been waiting for the other shoe to drop, and it finally did. The first sign was a headline on a local gossip site, innocuous at first glance, but loaded with implications: billionaire heir reconnects with former flame, a Cinderella story or calculated play? Karen had seen enough media spin in her life to understand exactly who had planted it. Alex's father had never been subtle. That same evening, her phone began buzzing with calls from unknown numbers, reporters looking for a quote, vultures disguised as journalists sniffing for scandal. She didn't answer. She never would. But her heart sank, not out of fear for herself, but for the quiet life she had fought so hard to build for her daughters. When she saw Alex the next morning, standing at his usual spot by the oak tree, his expression confirmed her suspicions. He looked angry, but not at her. The kind of anger that came from watching old powers try to manipulate a life that was no longer theirs to control. He approached her cautiously, his movements careful, but this time, his silence was filled with tension. "I wanted to warn you sooner," he said, his voice tight, "but I didn't know how to without making it worse. My father's trying to use you, to use them, to pull me back in line. He doesn't like that I've stepped away. He's trying to drag this into the spotlight." Karen folded her arms, standing her ground, her eyes sharp. "I figured as much. This isn't my first time being labeled as the gold-digging mother of your children. But I won't let him twist their lives for his game." Alex's jaw clenched. "I'm not going to let him touch you or them. I've started the process to sever legal ties. It's not clean. It's going to be messy. But I'd rather lose every dollar tied to his name than let him use you as a pawn." Karen believed him. For once, his words weren't coded in business language or strategic nuance. They were raw, personal. But she also knew how powerful families like the Hales operated. They didn't back down because of moral awakenings. They backed down when cornered, when exposed. "Publicity is what he wants," Karen said, her mind already weaving plans. "But not the kind he controls. If he wants a public story, fine. We'll give him one. The truth." Alex blinked, surprised, but quickly caught on. "You want to go public? On our terms?" Karen nodded. "I know a reporter. Someone who doesn't owe your father anything. Someone who'll tell it the way it is, not the way your family scripts it." It wasn't a plan born of revenge. It was born of exhaustion. She was done hiding, done letting others shape the narrative of her life. If Alex truly wanted to be part of their world, it would be through honesty, through standing beside her when the world watched, not hiding behind closed doors. The interview was set for the following week. Grace Monroe, a journalist known for dismantling corporate hypocrisy, arrived at Karen's apartment with no entourage, no flashy cameras. Just a notebook, a recorder, and a sharp, intelligent gaze. She listened as Karen told her story, not as a victim, not as a scandalous headline, but as a woman who had been forced to rebuild her life when the man she loved had abandoned her. Alex sat beside her, silent for most of it, only speaking when asked, his words careful, direct, but without defensiveness. When the article was published, it didn't spark a media circus. It sparked something quieter, but far more powerful. Support. Strangers who had no reason to care reached out with messages of understanding. Other women shared their stories of being cast aside by men who feared responsibility. And suddenly, Alex's father's weapon had become a shield, protecting the very people he sought to tarnish. Alex hadn't anticipated the shift. He had expected backlash, perhaps even legal threats. But what he hadn't expected was how the truth could disarm even the most calculated spin. His father's calls, once relentless, had stopped. The silence was its own victory. For Karen, it wasn't about winning a battle. It was about reclaiming her narrative, not for public approval, but for herself. And as she sat in the park that afternoon, watching Alex push Hannah and Holly on the swings with a quiet, steady presence, she realized the war wasn't about forgiveness. It was about choice. She hadn't chosen for Alex to leave. But now, every day he showed up, every morning he stood quietly at her side, was a choice. And slowly, piece by piece, Karen felt the weight of the past loosen its grip. Alex didn't need to fight for a title. He wasn't asking for fatherhood to be handed back to him. He was earning it the only way that mattered, by being there. And that, more than any headline, was the beginning of something real. The park had always been a place of routine for Karen, a predictable sanctuary where she could watch her daughters run free without the fear of life's complications encroaching on their small world. But today, the air felt different. It wasn't a change in weather or surroundings, it was something quieter, deeper, a shift in the way she watched Alex move among them. He no longer hovered at a distance. He was present now, in the smallest, most natural ways. He carried Hannah when she tripped and scraped her knee. He patiently let Holly braid his fingers as if they were strands of hair. He didn't ask for recognition or approval, he existed in their lives as if he had always belonged there. Karen had been cautious, testing his commitment with silence rather than words, waiting to see if his patience would fray. It never did. He had learned to listen more than he spoke, to notice the invisible tasks she juggled daily, and to quietly shoulder them without asking for gratitude. It wasn't a grand gesture that made her take notice that day, it was the way he instinctively wiped Holly's mouth after an ice cream spill, not with awkwardness, but with a father's gentle, practiced touch. It was the way Hannah reached for his hand without thinking, as though her little heart had decided for her that he was safe. Karen found herself watching him more often now, not out of suspicion but out of reluctant admiration. She had spent so long preparing herself for disappointment that she hadn't realized how exhausting it was to hold on to that armor. Alex wasn't the man she had known in that hospital room, but he wasn't a stranger either. He had become something else entirely. Someone who had been broken and had chosen to rebuild himself not through words, but through actions, one quiet moment at a time. Later that evening, as they walked home from the park, the girls skipping ahead, Alex walked beside her, not too close, not assuming, but present. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer filled with unsaid accusations. It was a quiet acknowledgement of shared space, of a rhythm they had unknowingly found together. "I didn't think you'd last this long," Karen said, her tone free of malice. It was a statement of fact. Alex glanced at her, a small smile playing at his lips. "Neither did I. But I've come to realize that leaving was easy. Staying, that's the hardest thing I've ever done." Karen nodded, appreciating the honesty. "They're starting to expect you, you know. Hannah asks if Uncle Alex will be at the park every morning." There was a flicker of pain in his eyes at the title, but he didn't correct her. "I'll be there. As long as they let me." The vulnerability in his voice struck her. He wasn't demanding a place. He wasn't even asking for one. He was simply hoping. Karen had never seen him like this. Stripped of arrogance, of entitlement, he was just a man trying to do right, not for his own absolution, but for two little girls who had no idea the journey he had taken to stand beside them. They reached the apartment building, and as always, Alex paused at the entrance, not crossing an unspoken boundary. But tonight felt different. Karen hesitated, her hand on the doorknob, an inner battle waging in her chest. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It wasn't about pride. It was about whether she was ready to admit that the life she had rebuilt might be strong enough to let him in. "You can come up," she said, the words tasting foreign but necessary. "The girls would like you to read them a bedtime story." Alex's breath caught, but he masked it with a nod. He didn't rush forward, didn't let his excitement betray him. He simply followed her up the stairs, matching her pace, as if every step was sacred. The apartment was small, still cluttered with toys and laundry that never seemed to fold itself, but to Alex, it felt like a palace. He sat on the living room floor as Hannah and Holly piled books into his lap, their energy infectious, their trust given without conditions. Karen watched from the kitchen doorway, arms crossed but with a faint smile softening her features. As Alex read, his voice animated and full of life, the girls curled up against him, their laughter filling the space in a way that felt transformative. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about filling the present with enough moments that the scars began to fade naturally. After the girls had fallen asleep, tangled in blankets and each other's arms, Karen handed Alex a cup of tea, motioning for him to sit on the couch. They sat in comfortable silence, the city humming faintly outside the window. "I'm not offering you a clean slate," Karen said, her eyes steady. "There's no starting over. But there is, continuing. Day by day. If you're willing." Alex's answer was simple, but it carried the weight of every mistake, every redemption, and every quiet promise he had lived by since returning. "There's nothing else I want more." It wasn't a declaration of victory. It wasn't an ending. It was the first genuine acknowledgement that they had somehow found their way to a place where the past no longer had to define them. The road ahead would still be uneven, but it was theirs to walk. And for the first time in a very long time, Karen allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Alex wasn't going to leave again. The first days of fall brought with them a new rhythm, one that Karen had not planned for but found herself accepting. The crisp air seemed to strip away the last remnants of the walls she had built around her small family. The leaves in the park began to shift from their vivid greens to deep golds and rusted reds, and with each morning that Alex showed up at their doorstep instead of waiting at a distance, it became less of a surprise and more of an expectation. Not just for the girls, who had long since decided he was part of their world, but for Karen herself. She had been prepared for a fight, for a man who would eventually tire of proving himself and retreat to the world that had once kept him insulated. But Alex had not left. His presence was no longer fragile, no longer tinged with desperation. It had become something steady, something grounding, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet ways he filled in the gaps of their daily life. He would fix the squeaky cabinet door without being asked, pick up extra snacks for the girls without seeking acknowledgement, and, most importantly, he listened. He listened to Hannah's long-winded stories about butterflies, to Holly's dramatic reenactments of cartoons, and to Karen's silences when she didn't have the energy to fill the space with words. It wasn't a single moment that changed things. It wasn't a dramatic confession or an emotional confrontation. It was the accumulation of small, consistent choices that Alex made every day to stay, to show up, to exist in the spaces where he had once been absent. Karen had spent so long preparing for disappointment that when it didn't come, she found herself cautiously wondering what came next. That question answered itself one Sunday afternoon. They had spent the morning at the park, as usual, but instead of walking back to the apartment, Alex suggested a detour. He was nervous, though he masked it well, fidgeting with the sleeves of his sweater as he guided them down a path Karen hadn't expected. They reached a small, quiet corner of the park where an old wooden gazebo stood, surrounded by fallen leaves. On the bench beneath it sat a simple box, wrapped in brown paper with a small ribbon. There was no audience, no cameras, no scripted scene. It was just them. Karen looked at him, suspicion flickering in her eyes, but before she could speak, Alex lifted his hands in surrender. "It's not what you think. No speeches. No rings. Just something I've been meaning to give you." She approached the box cautiously, the girls clinging to her sides, their curiosity radiating through their tiny hands gripping her fingers. She untied the ribbon, peeled back the paper, and inside found a necklace. It wasn't flashy or expensive. A thin, delicate chain with 2 small pendants, each engraved with a name, Hannah and Holly. Karen's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't realized how much she had wanted him to see them, not as symbols of his failure, but as his daughters, as his pride. Alex's voice was soft, almost hesitant. "I know I don't get to ask for much. But I wanted you to have something that isn't about me or my family or the mistakes I made. Just them. Just the 2 people who taught me how to be more than I was." Karen didn't know what to say. For the first time, she was unprepared. Her defenses, so carefully maintained, had nothing to latch onto. She looked at her daughters, their bright eyes reflecting back the simple truth: this man, the one who had once abandoned them, had chosen to stay in the quietest, most persistent way. Holly was the first to speak, pointing at the necklace. "Mommy, that's us." Karen smiled, a real, unguarded smile, and looked at Alex. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" He shook his head, his lips curling into a familiar smirk, softer now, humbled by time. "Not when it matters." She took the necklace, fastening it around her neck, feeling the weight of it settle against her skin, not as a burden, but as a quiet reminder of how far they had come. She didn't offer him forgiveness. She didn't offer promises. But as she took his hand, threading her fingers through his, it was enough. They sat beneath the gazebo while the girls played in the leaves, the afternoon light filtering through the wooden slats, casting golden patterns across their joined hands. For once, there was no tension, no anticipation of the next hurtful word or misstep. There was only presence, only the reality of what they had built, not perfectly, not easily, but piece by fragile piece. Alex didn't ask to be called Dad that day. Karen didn't offer it. It wasn't about titles anymore. It was about showing up. And he had done that, not just today, but every day since the moment he had decided to stop running. When they walked home, the girls holding both their hands as they skipped ahead, Karen realized that the life she had fought to protect had not been diminished by letting Alex in. It had been made stronger. Not because he completed them, but because he had learned to stand beside them without asking to be at the center. That night, after the girls were asleep, Karen found herself standing by the window, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. Alex was on the couch, dozing lightly, one arm draped over the backrest, a quiet presence in a space that had once felt too small for anyone else. She watched him, not with the weight of past betrayals, but with a cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, this was what it meant to rebuild, not to erase the cracks, but to let the light filter through them. She didn't wake him. She simply turned off the lights, leaving him there, part of the home he had once walked away from but had now, finally, earned his place within. And for the first time, Karen wasn't waiting for him to leave.